Today I'm talking about the new album by Katatonia called Nightmares as Extensions of the Waking State, released on June 6th, 2025. It's a follow-up to that 2023 album called Sky Void of Stars, which was one that I didn't like that much. So let's talk about some of the changes that were happening with the band.
Welcome to JC Rock and Metal Reviews, a place where metal lives.
The biggest change was the departure of their founding guitarist, Anders Nyström. Not only that, they also lost Roger Öjersson, who was with the band since the Fall of Hearts in 2016. This means they have two new members who are guitarists Nico Elgstrand and Sebastian Svalland. My apologies if I'm butchering those names. Another thing to keep in mind is that Jonas Renkse wrote the majority of the new record, as he was also the producer. Let me talk about the new sound on the album. If you've been listening to this band for a long time, you would know that their sound has evolved over the years. Their early albums sounded like Death Doom, but this most recent album, I guess you could say they have like two different styles, and these two different styles were apparent on this album. So for example, their sound leaned more towards progressive rock or progressive metal on albums like Fall of Hearts from 2016 or City Burials from 2020, but on albums like Dead End Kings from 2012 or the last one, Sky Void of Stars from 2023, they went more into a gothic metal direction while maintaining that progressive metal sound. On this new album, it seems like they're trying to do a combination of those two styles. In other words, it has the core sound of City Burials and Sky Void of Stars, but with more guitar riffs and some heavier guitars that could be heard on Dead End Kings. There are also some electronic elements used on the album. Not only that, but this band has always had a very cold and gloomy sound. But the album has some moments where the sound is a little warmer in some spots. I'll talk about that later. The production is also very clear. It helps you hear all the different textures and atmospheres. The album has 10 songs. It's approximately 46 minutes long, and there's also one song sung in Swedish called Efter, Solen, which means after the sun. I think the album has a lot going for it. For starters, there's a lot of musical diversity and atmosphere on the album. The album has a lot of variety. The band is able to seamlessly blend heavy progressive elements with atmospheric and melodic passages. I also noticed that the band has an ability to create a consistently gloomy atmosphere while incorporating different moods and textures throughout the entire album. Another thing that's evident on this album is that there is a strong musicianship. Lots of tracks feature notable technical elements, including melodic and technical guitar solos, complex drumming and odd time signatures, and the prominent bass guitar work that often carries the rhythm and the melody. This interplay between instruments appears to be well crafted, so if you take into consideration that this band has some new members, you can tell they definitely have some chemistry. Another thing I found was that this band uses a lot of effective dynamics. The band demonstrates skill in transitioning between heavier and lighter sections. There's a lot of heavy and light contrast in the songs, and that helps keep things interesting. Songs like Thrice and Lilac really show off that back and forth between the heavier and the lighter parts. Usually when I do these reviews, I make notes of the different bands they remind me of, and this time I mentioned a few progressive metal and or progressive rock bands I think they reminded me of. I think the biggest one was Opeth. I felt they used a lot of that, but there are also a few songs that reminded me of bands like Tool or Porcupine Tree or even Steven Wilson. Another thing I noticed was that this album has a very atmospheric production. Most of the songs are filled with these atmospheric sounds, clean guitar tones, and spacey elements that add depth and texture to the songs. So we have tracks like Departure Trails and Efter, Solen. Those really stand out in this regard. As for the vocal performance, Jonas Renkse's vocals are melodic and soft throughout most of the album, and it helps contribute to the album's emotional impact, and it really complements the songs well. The album also has lots of creative songwriting. The band uses a variety of approaches on different songs, so that keeps the entire album engaging throughout. But I have a few criticisms, so let me talk about those. I think the main one was a lack of originality. There were times when I felt songs were a little formulaic and they followed the same pattern with softer vocals in the verse and the heavier guitars in the chorus. I also felt there were not a lot of guitar solos. I think I mentioned maybe 2 songs that had them, and there could have been more. Maybe I didn't hear them. But I think the one track that stood out was called Temporal, and that one had a really cool guitar solo. I also felt some of the songs could have had better pacing. For example, the last track, The Light Which I Bleed, picks up the pace in the middle and then gets slower again, which is not always a bad thing, but sometimes it makes songs feel inconsistent. And I mentioned the vocals, how I like them a lot, but on the other hand, they do seem to be kind of the same at times. I also feel maybe like I would have liked some heavier death growls in some places. I also feel this band is trying to be a progressive metal band, but sometimes I feel they don't really find their identity and they just go in different directions, but it's not always cohesive. But with everything I just said that's negative, these are all minor criticisms. I think the album in general is pretty good. In conclusion, I feel it's a pretty decent progressive metal album. I thought it was a little on the lighter side, but I guess that's what the band wants to do right now. In general, the band is achieving what they're trying to do. They want to make a really dark and gloomy type of progressive metal album, and at least that's my interpretation of it. But there's one thing that can't be denied about this album, and that's the musicianship across all members is really solid. I would say the strengths are creating these big and dense atmospheric sections, and also being able to go back and forth between the heavy and the clean sections. Let me also give a shout out to the production team, who is Lawrence Macquarie, Adam Noble, and Robin Schmidt. I really thought that they created this really polished sound, and that really worked well with the material they were working with. In general, I felt this a little better than the previous album, Sky Void of Stars, because I remember I didn't like that album that much, but I think this one has a few better songs and it brought back some of those heavier guitars, which was kind of missing from that previous album, so that's why I like it a little more. And I think it's an album that can be enjoyed by longtime fans, but it's also accessible enough for newcomers. They play music that's technical and complex, but it still has melodic aspects for someone who's coming new. They're also not really breaking any new ground. They're playing the same type of music they've been playing over the last few albums, which is the last 10 years. And I mentioned in the first part of the video, I find a lot of similarities with those albums, but I think this one might be slightly better than some of the more recent ones. With that being said, I think my score is going to be 7.5 out of 10. I liked it. I wasn't completely blown away, but I feel it's an album that might go up after I listen to it a few more times. I thought it had some pretty decent singles, and those were some of the stronger tracks, but I also like the final song, In the Event Of, but otherwise, it's pretty decent. If you want to check out my review of A Sky Void of Stars, I'll stick it right there. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Please give the video a like. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you have not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.